The story takes place in a small, quiet village nestled by a winding river. The village feels old, almost forgotten by time, with narrow, dusty streets lined by dilapidated homes. The houses are modest, made from weathered wood and stone, showing signs of age and wear. Rustic fences surround gardens overgrown with wild flowers and vegetables, growing in an untamed chaos. The village is isolated, a place where struggles and hardships are common, yet there is an undeniable warmth to the air. The sunset casts long shadows, wrapping the village in a nostalgic, melancholic glow, hinting at the hopes and dreams that once filled the place, now replaced by the grind of daily survival. The poverty is evident in the old, crumbling buildings, but there is also a deep sense of community. The sounds of life, children playing, distant laughter, the creaking of wooden carts are reminders of the resilience and hope that still linger in the hearts of the people who live here. This village is a place that holds both hardship and warmth in equal measure. Enter the protagonist, an older woman named Mrs. Lan. Her once vibrant face is now lined with years of hard labor, but there is still a faint glimmer of hope in her deep brown eyes. Her hands, weathered and rough, speak of a lifetime of sacrifice, from farming to raising her son alone after her husband passed away. She wears a faded blue dye traditional dress, the fabric fraying slightly at the edges, reflecting her humble circumstances. Mrs. Lan walks with a gentle weariness, moving slowly but steadily, carrying the weight of the years, the losses, and the unspoken dreams. Her body is tired, but her spirit remains unbroken, and she carries herself with an innate grace that defies the hardships of her life. She is the pillar of the family, a woman who never gave up, even when everything seemed stacked against her. Beneath the exterior of strength, she is emotionally drained. Loneliness lingers in her heart, but she hides it well. Her thoughts often drift to the past, to the years spent raising her only son, Hung, and the sacrifices she made. Despite the gratitude and love she feels for him, she can't help but wonder if he's grown distant, if the care she once poured into him is now something he takes for granted. As Mrs. Land moves through the small village, she notices that her son, Hung, seems distracted when they cross paths. He doesn't greet her as warmly as he once did. There's a distance in his eyes, a shift in the way he looks at her, almost as if he's trying to avoid acknowledging the sacrifices she made for him. Inside the modest home they share, the silence is palpable. Mrs. Lan watches as Hung spends more and more time away, his conversations brief and filled with frustration. When he does speak, it's often about how tight and small their home is. His growing discontent is visible, though he never says it outright. There's a sense of unease that hangs in the air, as if something is slowly breaking between them. Mrs. Land remembers how, not long ago, she overheard Hung speaking to his wife, Mai, about how they need a better life, and that their small, modest house was no longer enough. The thought of his discontent gnaws at her, especially because it's rooted in the sacrifices she made to give him a better future. The constant tension between her loyalty to him and the unspoken resentment he feels is tearing at her. She begins to feel like the walls she worked so hard to build are now closing in around her. Mrs. Lun raised Hung on her own. After her husband died young, she worked the fields, struggled through illnesses, and put aside her own happiness to give him a future. She remembers when he was a child, full of innocence and gratitude, and how proud she was when he went to university in the city. But as he grew older, her sacrifices became less visible, less appreciated. The more she gave, the more he seemed to want. There is a deep emotional undercurrent of unacknowledged sacrifice, as Mrs. Land's love for her son seems to be repaid with a growing sense of distance and resentment. She wonders if it was all worth it, whether her efforts were truly for him, or if they have been for something else altogether. The relationship between Mrs. Lan and her son Hung has always been close, despite the hardships they faced. She was his only parent, the one who wiped away his tears, fed him when they had little, and cheered him on when he succeeded. Hung, in his younger years, was full of gratitude and affection for his mother. Kap ahanu maich, he would hug her, tell her she was the strongest woman he knew, and promised to take care of her one day. But over time, things changed. As Hung grew older, especially after moving to the city for his education, he became more distant. The more he achieved, the more dissatisfied he seemed with their small life in the village. He had dreams of wealth, of a bigger house, a better life, things that were far beyond the humble walls of their home. Mrs. Land could see that he wanted more, and it pained her to see him struggle between his loyalty to her and his desire to live in a world of comfort and luxury. Now, the boy who once clung to her like a lifeline was a man who, more often than not, avoided her gaze. His love for her seemed to fade into the background of his busy life. When Mrs. Land asked him to spend time together, he would nod distractedly, always in a hurry, always having something else to do. His words were polite, but empty. There was no longer that warmth in his voice. When they ate together, he would often bury his face in his phone, scrolling through pictures of new gadgets, expensive clothes, and flashy cars. Mrs. Land would sit quietly, feeling invisible, as her son's attention was captured by the world beyond their small home. Mai, Hung's wife, was a new source of tension in Mrs. Land's life. When Mai first arrived, Mrs. Land was hopeful. She had heard so much about her before the marriage, how beautiful and smart she was, how well educated. Mai came from a good family, and Mrs. Land believed that she would bring happiness and stability to their home. But things didn't go as Mrs. Land expected. From the very beginning, Mai made it clear that she didn't fit in with their simple life. She would often complain about the small house, the lack of modern appliances, the difficulty of living in the countryside. She was used to luxury, and living in a modest home with old furniture seemed like a step backward for her. The tension started to show in small, offhand comments. How cold the rooms were, how uncomfortable the bed was, how the food wasn't cooked well enough. Mrs. Land would smile through the comments, trying to make her feel at home. But each word stung. Mai never seemed to appreciate what was done for her. Mai had never known the difficulties of the village life. She wasn't used to the long hours of hard work, the small pleasures that came from living with less. Over time, her patience grew thinner. She seemed impatient with Mrs. Land's slow pace, her small house, and her ways. More than once, Mai would say, "I don't know how you've lived like this all these years." Her tone was sharp, but her eyes were colder. Mrs. Land couldn't shake the feeling that Mai looked down on her, like she was a burden from the past that Mai had to deal with. One afternoon, Mrs. Land was preparing lunch, as she always did. She was chopping vegetables when she noticed Mai standing by the door, looking out the window. "Hung hasn't been home much lately, has he?" Mai asked, almost casually, but there was a sharp edge to her voice. Mrs. Lang tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand. But Mai wasn't done. "I don't know how long we can keep living like this. This house is too small. I can't breathe in here." She said it loud enough for Mrs. Lang to hear, though her back was turned. Mrs. Lang paused. She felt a knot in her stomach. Her home was small, yes, but it had always been filled with love. Her love. That's what mattered, right? Wasn't it? Yet. Mai's words cut through her like a blade. Mrs. Land said nothing, but she felt the walls close in around her. She kept her head down and finished making lunch. Then, another evening, when Mrs. Land was serving dinner, Hung came home later than usual. Mai, who was already seated, didn't even look up when he walked in. Her gaze was locked on the television, her lips pursed. Hung sat down, grabbed his food, and began eating, but the silence between them was thick, like half-hearted answers. They were there, physically, but emotionally distant. No one seemed to care about her presence anymore. It was as though she was just another part of the furniture, nothing more. She could feel the growing rift between her and Hung. She tried to ease the tension by avoiding the difficult topics, pretending everything was okay, when deep down, she knew it wasn't. She kept a smile on her face, even when Mai's passive-aggressive comments cut through the air. Mrs. Land never asked for much, just the warmth of a conversation, the simple joy of being with her family. But it seemed that was too much. She felt invisible. When she asked Hung to spend time with her, he would nod and then disappear into the other room, his attention on his phone or his work. When she needed help around the house, it was as though they both had better things to do. Mrs. Land would feel the weight of the years pressing on her, the weight of being the only one who cared enough to hold the family together. But she kept going. For him. For them. One night, after dinner, Mai sat next to Hung, and Mrs. Land could overhear their conversation. "If you don't do something soon, this will never work," Mai was saying. "We're suffocating here." Hung didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes made Mrs. Land's heart sink. Had he already made up his mind? Was he going to side with Mai? Was he going to make her leave? In another moment, Hung quietly looked away when Mrs. Land needed his support. She had asked him to go with her to the market, but he had an excuse ready. "I'm too busy today, Mom." The words stung, but it wasn't the first time. He always seemed busy. Too busy for her. Too busy for their life together. Mrs. Land had been holding on to hope, hoping that the distance was just a phase, that things would change. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had shifted. The family was beginning to crack. Hung was starting to resent her sacrifices, and Mai was more focused on herself than ever. The love that had once held them together was slipping through their fingers. The cracks in the family's foundation were now clearly visible. Mai's subtle complaints had turned into open hostility. It started with snide remarks, things like, "This house is so old, it feels like we're living in the past," or "Why do we always have to eat this bland food?" But now, it was more direct. One evening, as they all sat at the dinner table, Mai looked at Hung and said with a biting tone, "If you want a peaceful life, you need to get rid of your mother. I can't live like this anymore." Mrs. Land froze. Those words cut deeper than anything she had heard before. She had been patient, always willing to give her son space to make his own choices, but this felt like a line being crossed. Mai didn't even try to hide her contempt for her mother-in-law anymore. There was no kindness left in her voice, just resentment and disgust. Mrs. Land tried to ignore it. Her heart shattered, but she pretended she didn't hear. She quietly picked up her plate and excused herself, wanting to hide the pain on her face. But Mai's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. She didn't need to say anything more. The message was clear. Hung, once so close to her, seemed lost in the middle of it all. He didn't say anything when Mai spoke. He just stared at his plate, looking down, his hands tight around his fork. Why wasn't he defending her? Why wasn't he standing up for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him? Mrs. Lan looked at him, searching his face for a sign, anything that showed he still cared. But he didn't meet her eyes. He looked away, his face cold and unreadable. That moment, Mrs. Lan realized that the bond between her and Hung had been slipping away for a long time. He had already chosen. He didn't have the courage to say it out loud, but it was obvious now. Mai had her grip on him, and the life they once shared, the warmth, the closeness, was fading into the background of his new world. The pain was unbearable, but even worse was the feeling of being unseen. She had raised him, worked herself to exhaustion for him, and now she was nothing more than an inconvenience. The more she tried to speak to him, the more he avoided her. If she asked him to do something around the house, his response was a quick, "I'll do it later." Later never came. He was too busy with work, with Mai, with the life he was building, without her. The tension was building, and Mrs. Lan felt it in every part of her being. She had spent her entire life giving, sacrificing, loving, without asking for anything in return. She had worked long hours in the fields, made sacrifices she didn't talk about, and stayed up late to ensure Hung had everything he needed. All she wanted was to see him happy, but now, as she looked at her son, she felt like a ghost. Had it been worth it? Was this how it was supposed to be? All her sacrifices, all the years she had put herself last, and now this? She had tried to make peace for so long. Every time Mai made a sharp comment or Hung avoided her, she swallowed that. But there was a growing realization that maybe this wasn't love anymore. Maybe the sacrifice she had been making had been in vain. She had poured her heart into their lives, but in return, she only felt more alone. She wasn't angry at them. She was heartbroken. What did it all mean if no one cared enough to notice? Mrs. Lan's thoughts kept racing. Should she keep trying? Was this her role now, to quietly accept whatever was thrown at her? Her resilience had carried her through many tough times, but this felt like a different kind of pain. The type that couldn't be ignored, the kind that wore you down piece by piece. One evening, after a long day of work, Miss Lan sat on the porch, staring at the darkening sky. The house was silent, except for the soft clink of silverware from the kitchen. Hung had gone out again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She thought back to when Hung was a little boy, his small hand in hers, as they walked home from school, the way he looked at her with so much trust in his eyes. But now, it felt like all that had vanished. Hung was gone in more ways than one. The mother who had cared for him, loved him unconditionally, was now invisible. The world she had built around him seemed to be crumbling, and she didn't know if she could keep up the pretend peace anymore. What if she left? The thought had crossed her mind before, but now it felt more real. She had always been the one to sacrifice, to keep things together. But she was tired. Was it too much to ask for a little respect, for a little recognition of all she had done? Maybe she had put her own happiness on hold for too long. Maybe it was time to leave. The breaking point came unexpectedly. It was just another typical night, but this time, the atmosphere felt heavier. Mai had invited some of her friends over, and the conversation turned to their new life in the city. Mai spoke with a tone that stung, her words meant to hurt. "You know, my mom is right," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We can't keep living like this. If Hung wants to have a future, we need to make some hard choices." She turned to Hung, her eyes narrowing. "Your mother should leave. You can't have both worlds." Mrs. Lan sat in silence. The words were like knives, sharp and cutting deep into her soul. It wasn't the first time she'd heard them, but something in the way Mai Tai said it made her heart feel like it was breaking. Hung didn't speak. He just sat there, staring into space. Had he already made his decision? The thought of leaving felt like a physical weight on Mrs. Lan's chest. She had always been the one who held everything together, but now it seemed like everything was falling apart. Could she just walk away, leaving everything she had known behind? Could she live with herself if she didn't fight for her own happiness anymore? As the night wore on, Mrs. Lan could feel herself unraveling. Every word from Mai, every look from Hung, felt like it was pushing her to the edge. The emotional toll was too much to bear. She had spent her whole life putting others first, but now she was questioning if that was enough. Was it time to finally speak up, or had she already been silenced for good? Mrs. Lane had never felt more alone. The house, which once felt full of love, now felt cold and suffocating. The past weeks had been one long, painful stretch of silence, only broken by the occasional snide remark from Mai or Hung's empty promises to fix things. The tipping point came one afternoon when Miss Lan found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the half-eaten meal on the table. The tears were already in her eyes, but she didn't care anymore. She was done being ignored. Mai was in the living room, laughing loudly with friends, as if nothing was. Hung had been out again, lost in his world, pretending to be too busy to notice what was happening around him. It was all too much. The years of sacrifice, the constant giving, the endless silence, it had taken its toll. For so long, Mrs. Lan had held everything together, hoping that things would change, that Hung would see her. But now, standing there in that moment, she couldn't continue being the silent, selfless mother who was forgotten as soon as her work was done. She had already given up so much, and it seemed like no one cared. Her heart was breaking, and there was nothing left to hold it together anymore. It was now or never. Mrs. Lan walked to the door, grabbed her coat, and took one last look around. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a prison. She closed the door softly behind her and stepped out into the cold night air. There was no going back now. Her decision was final. Mrs. Lan walked down the street, her mind racing with every step. The hurt she felt wasn't just from Mai's cruel words. It was the feeling of being invisible to her son, the man she had raised, the boy she had loved with every fiber of her being. She had never planned to leave. It wasn't even a choice she had considered before. But now everything felt wrong. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for a family that no longer valued her. If leaving was the only way to be seen, then that was what she would do. She didn't know where she was going, but she kept walking. Eventually, she found herself standing outside the small, modest cafe in the town. Her mind was still foggy, her heart torn, but she knew she couldn't go back to that house. Not like this. Back at home, Hung walked in a few minutes later. He froze when he saw that the door to the house was slightly ajar. May was on the phone, as usual, too caught up in her own world to notice. Hung pushed the door open further, only to find his mother's things. Her coat, her shoes, gone. It didn't take long for him to realize she had left. He called out her name. No response. He looked at Mai, who was still on the phone, her face unreadable. Why didn't she care? Why didn't he care? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. Mrs. Lan sat in the dimly lit cafe, her hands wrapped around a hot cup of tea. But as she sat there, staring into the empty cup, doubt crept in. Had she made the right decision? Could she really walk away from everything she had known? The years of love, the memories, the pain of leaving it all behind felt unbearable. After an hour, Hung found her. He stood in the doorway of the cafe, his expression a mixture of disbelief and regret. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither knowing what to say. It had been so long since they had looked at each other like this, without anger, without resentment, just the raw truth of everything that had been left unsaid. Hung walked over slowly, his steps heavy. When he sat down across from her, there was a long silence. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her like he was trying to figure out what to do. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Mrs. Lan's heart twisted. She looked up at him, her eyes full of emotion. "I tried, but you were too busy with Mai. You stopped seeing me. Hung, you stopped seeing what I was doing for you. You didn't even hear me when I was hurting. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't." Hung's eyes filled with regret, but he didn't know what to say. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the mess he had made of everything? How could he justify ignoring his mother when she had given him everything? Mrs. Lan didn't wait for him to speak. She knew. She had seen it in his eyes the day Mai made her demand, the day he avoided standing up for her. "I loved you, Hung, but now I'm just in the way. I've spent my whole life making sure you were happy, but you've forgotten who I am. I'm not asking you to choose between me and Mai, but I'm tired, Hung. I can't keep losing myself for people who won't even see me." The room felt like it was closing in. The quiet, the tension, it was too much. Mrs. Lan stood up and turned to leave, but Hung grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, almost desperate. "Mom, please, don't go. I know I've messed up, but I don't want to lose you." But Mrs. Lan didn't look at him. Her heart was already made up. "I have to, Hung. I have to find me again. I can't live like this anymore. It's over." And with that, she walked out the door, leaving her son behind. The decision was irreversible. The moment Mrs. Lan walked out of that cafe, everything changed. There was no going back to the way things were. The family, once so united, had now fractured beyond repair. Hong stood there, torn between his love for his mother and the life he had chosen with Mai. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. He would never be the same. The stakes were high. Mrs. Lan had made her choice. She had chosen herself, something she had never done before, and for the first time, she felt free. Mrs. Lan stood in the small apartment she had rented on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, just a modest space with chipped walls and a simple bed in the corner. But it was hers. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about whether someone was judging her or if she was in the way. She sank down onto the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edges of the blanket. The weight of her decision was heavy, but in a way, it felt like a freedom she had never known before. The silence in the apartment wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. There was no arguing, no tension in the air. It was just her, and for once, that felt enough. But as the days passed, the reality of leaving her family behind began to settle in. The quiet moments were comforting, but they also left room for reflection. Had she made the right choice? Would her son, Hung, regret what had happened? And what about Mai? Would they ever realize how much she had sacrificed for them all these years? Mrs. Lan lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached, but she couldn't take back what she had done. It had been her time. Time to stop living for others and start living for herself. But even in her quiet apartment, the echoes of her decision still haunted her. There was a part of her that wondered if Hung would come looking for her. Would he reach out? Would he want to fix things? The thought made her heart flutter with hope, but she quickly shut it down. This was her choice. She had chosen to stand up for herself, even if it meant severing the ties that had defined her life for so long. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Lan continued to live her life, slowly rebuilding herself. She found small joys, gardening on her balcony, volunteering at a local shelter, even just taking long walks in the park. She had begun to find her peace, but there was still a sadness that lingered in the background. Every time her phone buzzed, she wondered if it was hung, but no messages came. Was it worth it? She asked herself late one evening, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Did I make the right choice? She wasn't sure. But maybe, just maybe, it was something she had to do for herself. Hung, on the other hand, was still wrestling with the aftermath of her departure. At first, he tried to tell himself he didn't care. He had his life with Mai now, and that was all that mattered. But deep down, he knew the truth. He missed his mother. He missed her presence, her quiet strength. He missed the way she had always been there, even when he didn't ask. But now, all he had were the memories of her quiet sacrifice and the empty spaces where she used to be. Hung tried to reach out a few times, but he didn't know where to start. He was afraid of what his mother would say, or if she would even want to speak to him after everything that had happened. He couldn't help but feel guilty. And so, Mrs. Lan's journey continued. She had made peace with her decision, but the pain of the past didn't fade overnight. The family was fractured, and the future seemed uncertain. Would Hung ever come to her, asking for forgiveness? Would Mai ever realize the damage she had caused? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Time would tell whether the wounds of the past could ever heal, or if the family would remain broken forever. But for now, Mrs. Lan kept moving forward, her heart heavy but stronger than it had been in years. As Mrs. Lan sat on the balcony one evening, watching the sunset, she felt a strange peace settling over her. The days ahead felt uncertain, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The sound of footsteps from the street below caught her attention. She turned, half expecting to see Hung, but when she looked closer, it was just a stranger. Would Hung ever come for her? Would they ever heal? She didn't know, but she was ready to find out.